So over the last several weeks in the book of Numbers, they've gone up to the land of the promise, and the report from the spies was they're too big, and they doubted, and then they had to turn around. And so we left the borderland there and went south from Kadesh Barnea. And then the Lord's judgment on them was that they're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness, and that a generation is going to pass away. And so the Lord gives them some commands on how to live in that judgment. And today, as we continue on with that, we're going to see some more of the Lord's teaching and talking about how do you handle dead bodies, and considering that the people are going to spend 40 years in the wilderness, they're going to have to know how to process with dead bodies and maintain ceremonial purity and all of those different things. And so that's what 19 is focused on. And then we're going to look at Miriam's death, Aaron's death, some more of Moses's rebellion, and then they're going to start working their way back up to the promised land. And so there's some confrontation with some of the neighboring nations. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. So let's jump to 19:1, and I'm going to read the whole chapter and then talk about it. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is a requirement of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish, and that has never been under a yoke. Give it to Eleazar the priest. It is to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Then Eleazar the priest is to take some of its blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. While he watches, the heifer is to be burned, its hide, flesh, blood, and intestines. The priest is to take some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool and throw them onto the burning heifer. After that, the priest must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He may then come into the camp, but he will be ceremonially unclean till evening. The man who burns it must also wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he too will be unclean till evening. A man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. They are to be kept by the Israelite community for use in the water of cleansing. It is for purification from sin. The man who gathers up the ashes of the heifer must also wash his clothes, and he too will be unclean till evening. This will be a lasting ordinance, both for the Israelites and for the foreigners residing among them. Whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. They must purify themselves with water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day they will be clean. But if they do not purify themselves on the 3rd and 7th days, they will not be clean. If they fail to purify themselves after touching a human corpse, they defile the Lord's tabernacle. They must be cut off from Israel because the water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on them. They are unclean. Their uncleanness remains on them. This is the law that applies when a person dies in a tent. Anyone who enters the tent and anyone who is in it will be unclean for 7 days, and every open container without a lid fastened on it will be unclean. Anyone out in the open who touches someone who has been killed with a sword, or someone who has died a natural death, or anyone who touches a human bone or a grave will be unclean for 7 days. For the unclean person, put some ashes from the burned purification offering into a jar and pour fresh water over them. Then a man who is ceremonially clean is to take some hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle the tent and all the furnishings and the people who were there. He must also sprinkle anyone who has touched a human bone or a grave, or anyone who has been killed, or anyone who has died a natural death. The man who is clean is to sprinkle those who are unclean on the 3rd and 7th days, and on the 7th day he is to purify them. Those who are being cleansed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and that evening they will be clean. But if those who are unclean do not purify themselves, they must be cut off from the community because they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. The water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on them, and they are unclean. This is a lasting ordinance for them. The man who sprinkles the water of cleansing must also wash his clothes, and anyone who touches the water of cleansing will be unclean till evening. Anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean, and anyone who touches it becomes unclean till evening. All right. So this law is, probably the last of the laws that's given to the people as they are starting their 40 years in the wilderness. And so knowing that a whole generation is going to die off in those 40 years, they need to know how to handle the bodies of the dead. And what are the repercussions of touching dead bodies? Because death is a sign of uncleanness. It is a form of impurity. And so when somebody touches a dead body, that impurity transfers to them. And so they have this ritual that is developed from that the Lord gives them. And it starts with a red heifer, but then you also see there's red yarn and cedar wood. All of these things are red. And there are people who start looking for the red heifer as a sign of end time stuff. And that's not really something we have to worry about. That's not something we have to really get into, and especially not with a passage like this. The main thing that we should look at is all of these things are red, and red is a symbol of blood. And so Eleazar oversees the processing of the red heifer. And so it's taken outside the camp, it's slaughtered, and Eleazar brings some of the blood and he sprinkles it on the tent of meeting 7 times with his finger. But then all the rest of the blood and all of the entrails, everything from this heifer is burned outside the camp. And so they put the yarn and the cedar and all of the red heifer, all the stuff together to burn it and create a pile of ashes. And now these ashes are going to be part of this purification ritual, the symbolization of red as a sacrifice of blood, because touching a dead body is not a sin. So they don't need to go to the altar and make a sin offering. And so this is a kind of in-between thing where it's not about sin that defiles, but as a natural process of this world of people dying. That is what they need to be mindful of, and to ensure that they are not taking death lightly, and recognizing that they are honoring God even as they are working through this process of dealing with death and dying. And so Eleazar doesn't actually do the burning. A priest does. So one of the people in the priestly class does the burning. Eleazar is just overseeing it. And then they scoop up the ashes. And so anybody who has been dealing with red heifer, they are unclean because they touched the dead body. So they have 7 days. They got to or until evening. They have to wash their clothes. They're unclean till evening. Whoever scoops up the ashes, wash their clothes. They're unclean till evening. So they've got a day of uncleanness where they are separate from the congregation, the community in some way. And so then when somebody touches a body or is in a tent when somebody dies, the purification process begins. And so they start with scooping up some of those ashes and putting them in a mixture with water. And so the purification of the ashes, or the heifer as a symbol of blood and death, is mixed in. And so it's a sprinkling, and at one point a pouring out of water over somebody to help them, not to help them, but to symbolize that they are entering into this purification process, and it lasts 7 days. So they separate for 7 days. 3rd day, they're sprinkled with water. 7th day, they're sprinkled with water, and then they are no longer unclean. And so it's kind of a weird thing. But in that 7 days, one of the things that we should recognize is if somebody died and there was some kind of airborne illness in the house that killed this person, the family in the family in the tent being isolated from the rest of the community would, in theory, help contain any kind of airborne illness. And so 7 days is a good waiting period. As we have learned over the last year and a half, some kind of isolation with airborne illnesses is a good way to protect other people. And so while the ancient Israelites did not have the same understanding of germ theory that we have, there's some of the elements of the law that is like, stay away from other people if there's any kind of illness. So that's a practical reason for why these kinds of things are there. But also in that 7 days, if it's a family member who died, there's some time to mourn. to start that mourning process as they are dealing with the loss of a family member. And so so that's kind of the rationale behind it. One of the other interesting things is when it comes to purification, the priest does not have to do the purification of the tent and the family. Any clean person can go and scoop the ashes into the water, mix it, and do the sprinkling work. They just have to be clean when they start. So somebody who is in the tent can't go and do this, so they have to call out to a friend at the next tent over or something and say, hey, my family member died in the tent. I was in here. Can you go and get the ashes in the water, and let's work on this process of purification. One of the things that is also important in this is, like, in our culture, death is something that it often happens away from the home, but that was not the case in this time, and it's not the case in many parts of the world. Many parts of the world are much more involved with handling the death of a family member. We don't. And so reading these kinds of things, like, this is so strange and foreign to us. But the Lord is trying to give them practical ways to seek his purification, to grieve, and to make sure that they are handling death in an orderly way. And so this ritual also has some New Testament references. And in the book of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews is looking at how Jesus is greater than Moses and angels and the law and the priesthood, and over again, he's greater than all of these things. And the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 9, verse 13, he refers to the ashes of the heifer, stating, the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who, though the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. And then it goes on in Hebrews 10, 19 through 22. It says, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. And so this ritual of purification with the sprinkling of water, all of these things, Jesus has fulfilled that for us. And so when we think about purification as followers of Jesus, we don't have to go and look for the red heifer to make this happen for us. We turn to Jesus and we say, Lord, you are the final perfect sacrifice for us. And so, yeah, so that's one of the elements of the old covenant that is fulfilled in Jesus now for followers of him today. So let's go to chapter 20. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh, where Miriam died and was buried. Now that's it. Like, that's Miriam. We don't get much more information about Miriam's death. And Miriam, the older sister of Moses, who served as a prophetess and led the congregation or the community in singing and worshiping the Lord, she died. And she died she was not allowed to enter into the promised land because of her rebellion against Moses. And so she died. And so it's interesting just how little is given to her death. But so we get this instruction on how to handle a dead body. And then the next verse is Miriam died, or the next verse. So let's look at verse 2. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. And so they are doing the thing that they do. They quarrel, they complain. A chronology note here is in chapter 20. It says, in the first month, the Holy Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin. Now, the first month of what? There's a couple theories. It's the first month of the third year that they could be talking about, or it's the first month of the 40th year, and they're starting to make that journey up to the promised land. And in my reading, it seems like most of the commentators are leaning towards like this is the turning point that they're heading to the land that God promised to Abraham. And so when the community says it would be better if we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord, part of it is like an instantaneous discipline from the Lord at some point. There have been a few that we've already looked at, or over the last 40 years, as people and generations have died. It would have been better. These quarrelers are saying it would have been better if we had died with them. Verse 6, Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take this staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, we must bring you water out of this rock. Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he proved holy among them. And so they complain, and they're complaining about how there's no food, there's no water, and that's just awful. And so Moses and Aaron, they go and seek the Lord, which is the right thing to do. They go and pray, and the Lord says to them, take the staff and speak to the rock. And so Moses doesn't do that. Instead of speaking to the rock, he speaks to the congregation. He goes beyond what God had told him to do, and he starts to chastise the people, calling them rebels and saying, must we bring water out of this rock? And is Moses bringing the water? Is Moses the one who's doing this? Is Aaron doing this? No, it is the Lord's hand at work. And so Moses, he steps out of what God is calling him to do, and instead of speaking to the rock, he yells at the people, and instead of speaking to the rock, he hits the rock twice. Water still comes out. The people are still saved and preserved through this miracle of the water, but Moses did not trust the Lord and did not do what God commanded him to do. And so that's why the Lord disciplines Moses and says, you are not going to be able to enter the promised land. You are not going to be the one to bring them in because of your disobedience. And it seems harsh. It seems like when you're just reading, it's like, what did Moses do wrong? He's done this before. Previously, Moses was, the Lord instructed Moses to hit the rock, but that was before, and this is now. And so Moses did not follow his instructions. And so this act of rebellion is what keeps Moses from entering the land of the promise. And we're going to get to a point where Moses can look into the land, where he can see it, but he's never going to cross the Jordan River into the land that God promised to the people of Israel. And so one of the questions here is like, well, if Moses wasn't supposed to hit the rock, why did God tell him to bring the staff? And the staff is probably Aaron's staff. And this Aaron's staff was a sign of his authority and that as God's chosen person. And so Moses did not need to hit the rock with the staff. The staff was to be a sign to the people gathered there. This is the Lord's doing. And so because the Lord was going to bless the people, I think it's important to recognize that he can still bless people through the rebellious leader, through a leader who is not perfect, through a leader who is far from, who isn't able to do exactly what God called him to do. God is still able to bless his people because God desires to bless his people. God desires to provide and sustain the people of Israel. And so even thinking through like the last several years, there have been several religious leaders, church leaders who have had some kind of public falling. And some of them have been moral, some of them have been leadership style issues that have been, were troubling. Whatever the reason for a leader's fall, like one of the things that's hard is like people will say like, well, if this guy falls and like their ministry to my life, like, is it all worthless? And I think when we look at a story like this, we should still recognize that God always works through imperfect people because those are the people he has to use. And so if you've ever been in a situation where you've had a leader who had any kind of public failure or fall, don't throw out their influence in your life that was good. But I would just encourage you to say, you know what, there were a lot of good things that happened, but they're imperfect, and pray for them. Ask the Lord to heal and restore their heart, and whatever God wants to do. If they are going to come back into ministry, pray. But there are times where we have to wrestle with this and accept that if God could only use perfectly obedient people, then there would not be very many people who are available for that job. And so now Moses is no longer able. Aaron is not going to go. Miriam's dead. And so the top three people in the religious structure of Israel, the leadership structure, religious structure, they're not going to go into the promised land. But they're on their way up. Moses is still going to lead them there. And so that's where we pick up in verse 14. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying, "This is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come on us. Our ancestors went down into Egypt, and we lived there many years. The Egyptians mistreated us and our ancestors, but when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our cry and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. Now we are here at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory." But Edom answered, "You may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword." The Israelites replied, "We will go along the main road, and if our livestock drinks any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else." Again, they answered, "You may not pass through." Then Edom came out against them with large and powerful army. Since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. Now, let's go back to Genesis for a minute and remember, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. The descendants of Jacob become Israel. The descendants of Esau become Edom. And so Moses is writing to, their kin, essentially. Listen, we are coming home to the land that God promised us. And it would be great if we could just pass through your land. Edom is on the southeast border of what is now Israel, and it would be a direct route. There's a main thoroughfare right through Edom that could get the people there, and they're like, "We don't want to bother you. We don't want to do anything. We just want to pass through." And Edom says no. And now Edom can see, the king of Edom can see, like, this is a crowd of 2 million people. 2 million people passing through the highway is a major disruption to any kingdom. And so his no is a, protection of his own people. And, Moses writes back like, please. And he still says no. And so they decide to go a different way. And so they're actually going to go around the kingdom of Edom and up towards the north end of basically by the Sea of Galilee, which is where Jesus grew up, and then cut back down and then cross the Jordan River. And so it's the long way around to avoid conflict with their kin here at Edom. And so it does not seem fair, but it's also like the kingdom is protecting themselves. Now, Edom will have its own problems. And, hundreds of years after these events, the people of Israel will be taken into exile in Assyria and Babylonia. And the kingdom of Edom will rejoice that Israel is falling. And the small little book of Obadiah actually talks about God's judgment on Edom because of their attitude towards their kin, towards their brothers' descendants, and so this action here is not forgotten by the Lord, and it will come back around. And Edom ultimately does fall, and there is not a kingdom of Edom today, but the nation and the people of Israel are still around. And so there's a point of interest there, that God is still protecting and defending the people of Israel. So let's pick up verse 22. They're going to go around. The whole Israelite community set out from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, near the border of Edom, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will not enter the land I give the Israelites, because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Get Aaron and his son Eleazar and take them up to Mount Hor. Remove Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, for Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will die there. Moses did as the Lord commanded. They went up to Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses removed Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, and when the whole community learned that Aaron had died, all the Israelites mourned him for 30 days. So this event, Aaron's passing. So Miriam just died. The Lord tells Moses and Aaron, Aaron's going to die. So go up the mountain. And before Aaron dies, which would make all of his garments unclean, and the high priestly garments are important, and they're a symbol of purity of the high priest. And so it's like, before he dies, make the transfer of the priesthood over to Eleazar. So he does. And thinking about the scene, like set the scene, like 3 men go up the mountain, only 2 men come down. And the youngest man is in his father's clothes. And everybody would have recognized the significance of this event. Their first priest is dead. And now the new priest is coming into his role. Now the instructions on handling a dead body, this is a body that happened outside. Eleazar, and I don't know if Eleazar and Moses walked away from Aaron and just let him die. It doesn't tell us what happened. Like, it didn't say like these clothes were shifted over to Eleazar and then boom, Aaron died. But the people take 30 days to mourn his passing. And there's this phrase that's used here as talking about his death, gathered to his people. And this is the usual phrase to describe the death of righteous man in his ripe old age. It's used of Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses when we get to Numbers 31:2. And so it is a fearful mark of, as we look at this, it's a fearful mark of divine judgment to be left unburied and not gathered. And so this, even in Moses and Aaron in their actions at Meribah, the Lord is not judging Aaron for death, for his disobedience. He is still gathered to his people. He's not cut off. And so when we see that phrase, cut off from his people, for their impurity or their rejection of God's laws, as we've looked at throughout the law so far, that cut off from his people, there's a cut off from the community right now, but there's also a sense that it's a cut off from the people forever, for eternity. And so that's not Aaron's state. He's gathered to his people. And in the Old Testament, the realm of the dead was Sheol. And, we don't have a strong understanding of a afterlife at this point. Everybody died. Everybody went to Sheol. But being gathered to his people over time will come to be thought of as Abraham's bosom. And so like coming into the presence of Abraham, of the ancestors, and being gathered to his people in that way. And so so it's just an interesting little picture of this, the death of the priest, but then also recognizing that God is intentionally making the transition to Eleazar, and continuing there is no loss in the role of the priest. Like he doesn't have to separate himself for his own uncleanliness, but he will start that process of inaugurating the new priest, which is after the 30 days, probably of mourning, because the priest is not allowed to mourn. And so they'll do that whole instatement of the high priest that we read about in Leviticus. So there's other elements where people pass on the mantle of their leadership, and two of the most significant would be Elijah to Elisha, and Jesus breathing on his disciples in the Gospel of John. He's passing on the leadership to his followers. And so it's just important to note that God is constantly mindful of his leaders and how they are to carry on. There is no one leader who is the limit to the people of God. Like we all turn to Jesus as followers of Jesus today, but no one pastor is going to be the pastor of any church forever. And so looking at how we help make those transitions and recognize that God oversees those transitions, and watching with him is something that we can trust him with. So so Miriam died, Aaron died, and now we're going to start continuing working our path to into the land. And so they're going up, around, and coming down from the north to cross the Jordan River. Verse 21, when the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming along the road to Atarim, he attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. Then Israel made this vow to the Lord: if you will deliver these people into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's plea and gave the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their towns, so the place was named Hormah. And so Arad kingdom, they're like, here's an opportunity for us to eliminate these wanderers, these vagabonds, these people who don't have a home. If they come in here, they'll take our stuff. Essentially, is what Arad is thinking. And so the Lord enables them to defeat them and completely wipe out their towns. And so in the future, the people will conquer cities and they will live in those cities. They will, move into the houses that were built by the Canaanites. But Arad, this particular kingdom, they devote completely to the Lord to say, if you deliver us from this, we will give them everything over to you. Like, we're not going to move into their houses. We're not going to take their stuff. We're just going to destroy all of it. And the Lord answers that prayer. Now, the conquest of Israel, or the conquest of the Promised Land, is going to be troubling to our modern sensibilities. Like, it is not an easy thing to process, but it is, part of God's plan for sustaining his people is to remove the idolatry of the land. And so while the people of Arad are not in the promised land proper. They're on the east side of the Jordan River. They are still a part of that Canaanite religious system. And so the Lord is showing them, like, I can sustain you. I can help you defeat these enemies. And so they do. But the people are still complaining. So verse 4 of chapter 21, they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food. Now, this miserable food is the manna that God has miraculously provided for the people for 40 years at this point. Every day, there's food for them. And it's a miracle, and God is making it happen. But their complaint is there's no bread, there's no water, and and we hate this food. But so God is giving them bread and providing for them for water, but they are still complaining. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, we have sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it on a bronze pole, or put it on a pole. Anyone who bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. So complaining about lack of food and water and the food that they have. And so God sends fiery serpents. And so that's the literal translation of the venomous snakes, fiery serpents. And so it's probably called fiery serpents because when they bit you, it burned. And they came and the people realized, like, this is a problem. We repent, please forgive us. And God gives them a weird instruction here to make this bronze serpent, and people look to the serpent, they're healed. Other places in the law, it tells them to not make any kind of graven image. And so this is a weird allowance that the Lord makes. Like, look to this bronze serpent to see to see the cause of your pain. But as you look to the cause of your pain, the Lord will bring healing in your life as well. And so they do, and it works. And even now, when you look at I believe it's called the caduceus, it's a serpent on a pole, right? And it is coming from this kind of imagery from the Old Testament here, this bronze snake on a pole. Now, this serpent on the pole becomes a problem for the people of Israel. And in the days of Nehemiah, the people actually start to worship the serpent on the pole. They treat it like an idol. And so Nehemiah wisely destroys it and takes away that idolatrous temptation from the people. But then also later on in Jesus's ministry, he's talking to Nicodemus and talking about how, you can't be saved unless you're born again. And Nicodemus is like, well, how are you going to be born again? And Jesus, his response is to refer back to this. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, and all who looked to the serpent were saved, so the Son of Man must also be lifted up, and all who look to the Son of Man will be saved. And so what's so beautiful here is Jesus is equating this serpent to himself and saying, like, this serpent was the curse, and the looking to the serpent was to help you remember the curse and to remember that God saves. And so when Jesus is saying, I am going to be lifted up, Jesus became sin. He didn't become like sin, he became sin. And on the cross, he bore the curse of sin. And so when we look to Jesus, we are saved. And so there's this beautiful moment here in this passage where we see God's saving work, but ultimately it is just a type that looks to the future. And for followers of Jesus, we look at this and we say, Jesus fulfilled that as well. So just as Jesus and the red heifer and all the sacrifices, he's our purification. When we look at sin and the curse of sin, we remember that we need to be saved from that. We look to Jesus, and he is the Savior that we need. He became sin so that we might become the righteousness of Christ, of God. And so it's a beautiful little story that we You can just read through real quick and be like, oh, that's weird, keep moving. But looking at how all of this connects through the scriptures to Jesus is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Excuse me. All right. Let's look at, because they're going to keep moving now. They've got the serpents under control, and now they're heading into Moab. Verse 10 of chapter 21. The Israelites moved on and camped in Obat, where they set out from Obat and camped near Ai Abarim in the wilderness that faces Moab toward the sunrise. From there, they moved on and camped in the Zered Valley. They set out from there and camped alongside the Arnon, which is in the wilderness extending into the Amorite territory. The Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. That is why the book of the wars of the Lord says, Zahab and Sapha and the ravines and Arnon and the slopes of the ravines that lead to the settlement of Ar and lie along the border of Moab. From there, they continued on to Beer, where the well where the Lord said to Moses, gather the people together and I will give them water. Then Israel sang this song, spring up a well, sing about it, about the well that the princes dug, that the nobles of the people sank, the nobles with the scepters and staffs. Then they went from the wilderness of Mattanah, from Mattanah to Nahaliel, from Nahaliel to Balmot, and from Balmot to the valley in Moab, where the top of Pisgah overlooks the wasteland. And so this is part of their travel route. And there's an interesting thing mentioned here in the books of the wars of the Lord. And we don't have that book. We don't know what that book is. But it is interesting that even in the Old Testament, there are some references to books that are outside of what we call the canon of Scripture that they would have known about, but we don't have them. And so I just think that's important to just note that there's some little footnotes to things, lost books of history. And yeah, it's just an interesting thing. There's other books later on in the historical books that are the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. We don't have that book either, but the book of Chronicles tells us about it. And so we're like, well, where's the Chronicles of Israel? Well, somehow it got lost to time. And so we partly have to be just okay with that, that there are some mysteries that we can't answer. And then the people are perched on the hilltop. They can look over the wasteland of Pisgah. And in verse 21, Israel sent messengers to say to Sihon, king of the Amorites, let us pass through your country. We will not turn aside on any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway until we have passed through your territory. But Sihon would not let Israel pass through his territory. He mustered his entire army and marched out to the wilderness against Israel. When he reached Jahaz, he fought with Israel. Israel, however, put him to the sword and took over his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, but only as far as the Ammonites, because their border was fortified. Israel captured all the cities of the Amorites and occupied them, including Heshbon and all its surrounding settlements. Heshbon was the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and had taken from him all the land as far as Arnon. That's why the poets say, and here's another one of those things, who are these poets? We don't have this book. Come to Heshbon and let it be rebuilt. Let Sihon, city be restored. Fire went out from Heshbon, a blaze from the city of Sihon. It consumed Ar of Moab, the citizens of Arnon heights. Woe to you, Moab! You are destroyed, people of Chemosh. He has given up his sons as fugitives and his daughters as captives to Sihon, king of the Amorites. But we have overthrown them. Heshbon's dominion has been destroyed all the way to Dibon. We have demolished them as far as Nopah, which extends to Medeba. So Israel settled in the land of the Amorites. After Moses had sent spies to Jazer, the Israelites captured its surrounding settlements and drove out the Amorites who were there. Then they turned and went up along the road toward Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, and his whole army marched out to meet them in the battle of Edrei. The Lord said to Moses, do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands, along with his whole army and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon. So they struck him down together with his sons and his whole army, leaving them no survivors, and they took possession of his land. So the people of Israel are now confronting the neighboring nations, and the nations are saying, you cannot pass through, we will attack you. But Israel is also now out of options. This is how we need to get into the land. And so they go to war. And the Lord provides victory for them in both of these cases. And here, as opposed to Arad, the Israelites actually move in to their cities and live in their towns. And later we will see that 3 of the tribes say to Moses before going into the land, like, we would actually like to stay here. This land is good for us. It's good pasture land. There's already homes here. And so 3 of the tribes will actually stay on that side of the Jordan, and the rest will go into the Jordan River, or across the Jordan, and go in and occupy that land. Those 3 tribes, though, they must send warriors with the other tribes to actually do the work of settling the land of Israel. And so all of these travel logs and these wars, we don't get a a miraculous account of how God defeats these enemies early on. We read the story about how Moses lifted up his staff, and when his staff was lifted up, the Israelites were winning, and when his arms fell down, they were losing. And so Aaron and Hur hold up Moses's arms so that the people can win. Like this, there's this miraculous element to these early wars. And a part of that is because the people of Israel were slaves months before. And so the Lord is providing and protecting for them and through the miracles. But now they've had 40 years to train, 40 years to learn how to defend themselves. And so like they are now more capable in these moments. The Lord still says, I will ensure the victory, but the people actually go and do the work of the warfare as well. And so one of the notes here as well is there's a reference to Chemosh, who is the Moabite god, and he's mentioned in this taunt song. And Chemosh is going to be a major struggle and temptation for the people of Israel later. And the worship of Chemosh is something that, and I'm saying this wrong every time, I'm sorry, is something that is completely despicable to the Lord. They would offer their firstborn child on the altar and thinking that would give them power and please Chemosh. But Yahweh will not abide it, will not allow it. And so this is one of those taunt songs to the people of Israel, pointing out how Yahweh is greater than their gods. And so, so that's where we're going to stop tonight. Any questions on numbers 19 through 21? Next week, we're going to talk about Moab and Balaam and the donkey, and it's going to be super fun. And so it's one of my favorite passages. So any questions from these chapters tonight?
I thought it was really interesting that that they included the ash in water because that's how you get lye, which is used in soap making. So that's also kind of an interesting use for the ashes and the purification.
Yeah, that is interesting. That did not come up in any of my research. So thank you, Christy. I don't know how to make soap. So, yeah.
There's also in Dove's family, when we do Passover, we have a cup for Miriam at the Passover Seder in honor of Miriam's well. And so while you were talking, I kind of looked it up to get the on a Jewish kind of explanation site, basically. And they talked about Miriam's well. They, according to their tradition, the rock that Moses struck the first time to get the water followed them through the desert. And so they always had water wherever they went. And so this same rock, when she died, dried up because that was her her gift to the or what do they call it? Her merit. They said the three merits or the gifts that the Jews had in the desert, the well of water, the pillar of clouds, and the manna, were the merits of Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, respectively. So when she died, that's why Moses had to speak to the rock to get it to open again, because it was also it was affected by her death. So I thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah. That is interesting. Paul actually refers to the rock that followed the people as well. So it's not just in like in Jewish tradition. We do reference that in the New Testament. We see that it carries over into Christian understanding. Yeah, but I didn't. Again, it's like the Christian commentators I read did not mention like Miriam as a tie to that rock. So that's just an interesting connection. So yeah, thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on these passages?
I got a couple.
Yeah.
As always.
Yeah.
So it doesn't say that much about the travel for the 40 years, but it doesn't, is that the 40 years starts after chapter 21?
Well, the 40 years started in 18, essentially. And then in 20, when Miriam dies, that first month is most likely the first month of the 40th year.
Okay,
And so we don't get a lot of information on 40 years. Like the 40 years they're in the wilderness. That's it. Like,
what's God gonna put? They complained and they complained and they complained.
right. Yeah. It's kind of like one of those, like you read somebody's diary of like traveling across the plains to come to Oregon, on the Oregon Trail. And it like most of the diary is like, yeah, we did more walking. Today we walked more. So, the Moses is a good editor here. And so it's like, we don't need to hear about this. So like, we don't need to hear. And then, we invented a game. So there's none of that. Yeah.
The other question I had, the snake that he lifts up, is that symbolic? Because there's two different things. There's the Sadduceus and the rod of Asclepius.
Uh-huh.
I think the medical profession is the rod of Asclepius. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But which would that have been? Like a sign of medicine? And what is the Sadduceus? Or I don't know how you pronounce that. What does that symbolize? They're both snakes. But I thought the Sadduceus, wasn't it two snakes intertwined? One of them has two snakes intertwined and one has one intertwined against the staff.
Yeah. I don't remember which is which, but the what it represents is just healing. That's it. Like for like why people put those up on their medical things is like, this is a house of healing. Like that's what they want to communicate. And so is there any like miraculous power happening in those places? Well, yes, God can do miracles anywhere, but it is not like they're not like making a claim to divinity and divine action in those places, but it's just has become a symbol of healing. So
the other thing you were talking about, that Kamesh thing, all these different people had so many weird different religions, things they did. But you said Kamesh is the killing of their firstborn. Isn't that kind of similar to Baal?
Yeah, a lot of these idols or false gods, demons in the Canaanite religions, like they required the sacrifices that were abhorrent to the Lord and practices in their worship that were disgraceful in a lot of different ways. And so one of the so there's some similarities, but they have distinctions. And I'm not an expert in Canaanite religious systems, so I couldn't like list all of the different problems that they had. But the main reason for the why God is calling the people to drive them out of Canaan or the promised land is because of their wicked practices in worshiping these false gods. like the Canaanites brought impurity to the land of the promise. And so that's why God told them to drive them out, to eliminate them. And one of the main problems throughout the Old Testament after the establishment of the people of Israel in the land is they did not do that. They did not drive out all of the Canaanites. And so these idols kept creeping in to the practice of the people of Israel. And so this is why God sent the prophets. Ultimately, what led them to exile was their participation in idolatry and not trusting the Lord, but looking to false idols. And then also how they treated the poor and the foreigner and the widow, all of these different things that were contrary to God's design and a path for life. The people kept falling back into the worldly systems. And so, yeah. But Chemosh, Baal, and there's a bunch of different Baals, Baal, however you say it. There's a bunch of them. Because Baal just means Lord. And so Baal Zebub is Lord of the air, and so there's all kinds of different Baals that they worshipped in the land of Canaan. And so, yeah, it's complicated for sure.
It's just weird. How did these people even come up with this weird analogy? All these different religions, did something work for them one time and they're like, oh, we worship that? I mean, all these other cultures. How did they come up with all this weird stuff?
Well, I can't speak to how they all are originated, but a basic biblical view of these different religions is that these are motivated by demons. And so people are opening their hearts and their lives to demonic influence, and the demons lead the people to do terrible things. And so looking specifically at the religions in Canaan, like those are tied to demonic activity. And so they become these rulers, spiritual rulers and principalities and powers. And we referred to in Ephesus, in our study in Ephesus, like Paul talks about that. Like there's these regional lords over areas. And, the people of Israel, as they're going into the land, are called to defeat those idols and drive their power out of the land. And so, but that's also one of the things Christians are to do now. And we don't do that through warfare, because our weapons, as Ephesians says, our weapons are not against of this world, and we don't wage war against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the rulers of the air. That's what Paul says in Ephesians. So, but yeah, it's a demonic influence that is pulling people away from the Lord God. So,
well, I know
does that help?
A little bit, yeah. A long time ago, I'd studied a little bit about their cultures, and it's weird how a lot of the things that they worshiped it was the same one. Like they would worship Venus, which other name was Helena, Aphrodite. It was all these different names, different regions, same thing. And right. Hermes is the same as what, Mercury or something like that. I don't know. A study from like 20 years ago. But it's weird how they ran with one significant thing, say Venus, and they had multiple 25 names for the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's because God is the creator. And so since we are made in his image, we also have that creative bent, but angels and demons don't. So they're just going to use what works. If it worked with these people, it'll work with these. So
again, they have to utilize what they can, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and as more cultures start intermixing over time, they start sharing ideas. So like Hermes and Mercury, it's like, oh, we have a god that is like that. They're probably the same. So, because that's a difference between Roman and Greek mythology. And so they come together as the Romans and the Greeks rule the world. So yeah, in different times. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts, questions? Numbers has a lot of numbers in it, but it also has a lot of cool stuff. So it's it's a little bit more action oriented than Leviticus was. By a little, I mean a lot. And so there's a lot going on in this book. And then Deuteronomy, I love Deuteronomy. Just heads up. I mean, it's basically a big long speech from Moses. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be great. But this is really where the action is for the Pentateuch. And so next week we'll see Balak, the king of Moab, calls up Balaam to say, come and curse the people. And Balaam's like, I can only speak what the Lord tells me to speak. And so you're like, what is this? How is Balaam a prophet of God? He's not a part of Israel. What's happening? So it's going to be good. It'll be interesting. I don't know if I have all the answers yet, but I have a lot of questions. So
The other thing I need to ask too is they don't give much, the Bible doesn't depict on a lot. They went from being not warriors, and then somehow miraculously, when they're going out battling these people, they're really good warriors. Where'd they get their skills?
That's that 40 years.
On that.
yeah, that 40 years of training, but I mean, the Lord's working in them and through them. So he's on their
Well,
side.
there's hope. God loves warriors, and there's hope.
Yeah, true. All right, y'all. Well, let's wrap it here, and we will be back next week. And so on Sunday, if you're coming in person, we have 10 o'clock service, and there's donuts afterwards. So, all right.
Amen.
So, all right. Cool. All right. We'll see you guys later. Have a great week, and
Amen.
God bless.
Thanks,
Can I put one
Jason.
there, guys?
Thank you.
God bless you, Jason.